Episode 9: The Sacred Grove. There was a tree at Kauppala. Not just any tree, a tuomi, what English speakers call bird cherry, a species that grows abundantly across northern Europe. In spring, this particular tuomi would have bloomed white, its clusters of flowers filling the air with sweet fragrance. In summer, its leaves would have rustled in the wind off Lake Ladoga. In autumn, it would have produced dark berries that birds devoured eagerly. In winter, it would have stood bare but dignified, its branches outlined against gray skies. It was, by all accounts, vast. Ancient. The kind of tree that makes you stop and look up, that commands presence simply through its age and size. The kind of tree that seems to have been there forever and that you assume will be there forevermore. But what made this tuomi truly remarkable was not its size or age but its sanctity. This tree was holy. For generations, perhaps centuries, people had brought offerings to its base. The first milk from a cow that had just calved. The first grain from the harvest. Gifts of mead, of bread, of silver coins. These were not decorations but sacrifices, offerings made to ensure good fortune, to honor the spirits, to maintain the delicate balance between the human world and the forces that govern fertility, prosperity, and fate. Every village around Lake Ladoga had such a place, a holy tree, a sacred stone, a blessed well. Places where the old ways persisted, where pre-Christian beliefs had been woven into Orthodox Christian practice, creating a syncretic spirituality that honored both the new faith and the ancient powers of the land. And then one day, a man from Jaakkima, drunk on vodka, contemptuous of tradition, or perhaps both, cut down the sacred tuomi at Kauppala. The tree fell like thunder. The people stood in fear. And the curse fell upon him before the year ended. This is the story of the sacred grove, of holy places and the price of desecrating them, of offerings made to spirits whose names we may have forgotten but whose power persisted in belief and in the consequences that followed when that belief was violated. The landscape of the sacred. Before Christianity came to Karelia, and indeed, long after it arrived, the people of this region understood their landscape as alive with spiritual presence. Not every tree was sacred, but certain trees were. Not every stone held power, but certain stones did. Not every spring was holy, but certain wells demanded reverence. The landscape was differentiated into mundane space and sacred space, ordinary places and locations where the boundary between the material world and the spiritual world grew thin. How did a place become sacred? Sometimes through ancient tradition whose origins were lost, it has always been so. Sometimes through events that occurred there, a vision, a miracle, an answered prayer. Sometimes through obvious natural features, an unusually large tree, a stone of strange shape, a spring with healing properties. Once established, sacred sites became focal points for religious and communal activity. They were places where individuals came to pray, to leave offerings, to seek blessings or intercession. They were places where communities gathered for seasonal rituals, for rites of passage, for collective celebrations of the agricultural cycle. And crucially, they were places protected by powerful taboos. You did not cut a sacred tree. You did not move a holy stone. You did not pollute a blessed well. To do so would be to invite disaster, not merely social disapproval but spiritual retaliation, curse, the withdrawal of the powers that protected the community and ensured its prosperity. Theodor Schwint, collecting folklore in 1879, found evidence of these sacred sites everywhere in the Lake Ladoga region, even though many had fallen into disuse or been actively suppressed by religious authorities. At Kauppala, the great tuomi tree had been the center of offering practices. At Kauppala stood an ancient tree, a tuomi vast and tall / where the people brought their offerings, summer, spring, and fall. At Heinasenma, on the island where a monastery had once stood, there were sacred crosses where people brought offerings. These crosses represented the syncretic blending of Christian symbols with pre-Christian practice. The cross was Christian, but the act of leaving offerings at its base echoed older traditions of honoring spirits at sacred locations. At Sarola, there were stones, specific stones, marked as holy, where people brought offerings. The mention of stones of Sarola suggests multiple sacred sites within a single community, different locations serving different purposes or honoring different spirits. Throughout the region, the pattern repeated: every village had its holy place, by stone or tree or well/where the old believers gathered, where the ancient spirits dwell. The practice of offering. What did people bring to these sacred places, and why? The offerings mentioned in the Kauppala story are specific and revealing: first milk from the calving cow, first grain from harvest field/to the spirit of the sacred tree, these gifts they'd always yield. First fruits, the initial products of any endeavor, held special significance across many cultures and religions. The first milk from a cow that had given birth was precious, rich with nutrients, symbolizing fertility and new life. Giving it to the sacred tree rather than consuming it or selling it was a genuine sacrifice, a recognition that prosperity came not solely from human effort but from forces beyond human control that deserved acknowledgement and thanks. First grain from the harvest similarly represented sacrifice of valuable resources. In subsistence agricultural communities, every bit of grain mattered. To take some of the first harvested grain, before you had secured your own winter food supply, and offer it to the spirits was an act of faith, a statement that maintaining right relationship with spiritual powers was more important than maximizing material gain. The song mentions other offerings as well: bread and salt and silver, milk and grain and mead/we offer to the spirits everything they need. Bread and salt were staples of life, symbols of hospitality and sustenance. Silver represented wealth, material value consciously given away. Mead, fermented honey drink, was precious and festive, reserved for special occasions. These offerings created reciprocal relationships. Humans gave to the spirits, and in return, the spirits were expected to provide protection, fertility, good weather, healthy livestock, successful harvests. It was a contract, understood and maintained through regular offerings at sacred sites. But it was also more than mere transaction. The act of bringing offerings to the sacred tree was itself meaningful. It required people to pause in their labor, to walk to the holy place, to consciously acknowledge dependence on powers beyond themselves. It was a practice that cultivated humility, gratitude, and awareness of human vulnerability in the face of nature's unpredictability. For Orthodox Christian authorities, these practices posed a challenge. On one hand, they seemed like pagan survivals, worship of nature spirits that competed with proper Christian devotion. On the other hand, they were deeply embedded in community practice and belief, and attempting to suppress them entirely risked alienating the population. The result was often compromise and syncretism. Sacred trees might be allowed to remain but would be blessed by priests and associated with Christian saints. Holy wells might be dedicated to the Virgin Mary or local Orthodox saints. The practice of leaving offerings might be reinterpreted as votive offerings to saints rather than sacrifices to spirits. This created a layered religious landscape where people might attend Orthodox services on Sunday while also leaving milk at the base of a sacred tree on Monday, seeing no contradiction between the two practices. Both were ways of maintaining right relationship with the powers, Christian and pre-Christian, that governed their world. The sacred tuomi of Kauppala. The tuomi tree at Kauppala seems to have been particularly venerated, suggesting it was exceptionally old, exceptionally large, or associated with particularly powerful traditions. Tuomi, Prunus patus, bird cherry, is a common species in northern Europe, but individual trees can live for a century or more and grow quite large. A tuomi of great age would be notable, and in a landscape where most trees were eventually cut for timber or fuel, a tree that had been protected from cutting for generations would stand out dramatically. The tree's location at Kauppala is significant. Kauppala, as we've discussed before, was a marketplace, a trading center where people from different villages gathered. A sacred tree at such a location would serve a wider community than a single village, becoming a regional center of spiritual practice. The offerings brought there represented the agricultural and pastoral economy of the region: milk from cattle, grain from fields, products of farming and animal husbandry. The tree, in some sense, received the first fruits of the land's productivity and blessed the continuation of that productivity in return. How long had this practice continued? The story doesn't specify, but the characterization of the tree as ancient, and the offerings as something they'd always yield, suggests generations, possibly centuries. This was not a recently established custom but a deeply rooted tradition. The people who brought offerings were described as old believers, a term with specific meaning in the Russian Orthodox context, where it often refers to those who rejected liturgical reforms and maintained older practices. But in the Lake Ladoga folklore, old believers seems to mean something broader, those who maintained the old ways, the pre-Christian or syncretic practices, regardless of their specific Orthodox affiliation. These old believers gathered at the sacred tree. The gathering itself was important. This was not merely individual piety but communal practice. The tree served as a meeting point, a center for social cohesion as much as spiritual activity. The desecration. And then it ended, catastrophically, through the action of a single man. Then came a man from Jaakkima, drunk on vodka strong / he cut down the sacred tuomi, though they told him it was wrong. Several elements of this story are significant. First, the man is identified as being from Jaakkima, not Kauppala. He is an outsider to the immediate community, though not a complete stranger. Jaakkima was a nearby parish, part of the same general region. This outsider status might have made him less aware of the specific sanctity of this particular tree, or less bound by the community norms that protected it. Second, he was drunk. Vodka, though the Finnish/Karelian word might originally have been vina, any strong distilled spirit, had loosened his inhibitions, clouded his judgment, made him reckless or contemptuous of warnings. Third, crucially, people told him it was wrong. This was not ignorance but defiance. He was warned. He was told that the tree was sacred, that cutting it would bring disaster. And he did it anyway. Why? The story doesn't explain his motivations in detail. Perhaps he needed timber and saw a large tree. Perhaps he was testing the belief, skeptical of the power of curses, wanting to prove that superstition held no real danger. Perhaps in his drunkenness he simply didn't care, didn't believe, or actively wanted to offend. The tree fell like thunder and the people stood in fear. The crash of a great tree falling is indeed like thunder, a tremendous noise echoing across the landscape. But the metaphor carries deeper meaning, thunder as omen, as divine anger, as the universe responding to violation with violent sound. And the people's fear was not just of the physical danger of a falling tree but of the spiritual consequences. They knew what had been done. They knew what would follow. The curse fulfilled. And the curse fell upon him before the ending of the year. The story is economical in its description, but the implication is clear: the man who cut down the sacred tree died, or suffered some terrible misfortune, within months of the desecration. What actually happened to him? Schwind's sources don't provide specific details, but the pattern is familiar from curse stories worldwide. The violator of sacred space meets a bad end, and the community interprets that bad end as the inevitable consequence of the violation. Did the curse kill him directly through supernatural means? Or did it operate through more mundane mechanisms? Perhaps the guilt and social ostracism affected his mental state, leading to depression or reckless behavior. Perhaps the community's belief in his cursed status became self-fulfilling as people avoided him, refused to trade with him, treated him as doomed and thereby made that doom more likely. Or perhaps it was simply coincidence. The man happened to fall ill or have an accident within a year of cutting the tree, and the community interpreted that misfortune as curse fulfillment because that's how their worldview understood causation. From a folklore perspective, what matters is not the mechanism but the meaning. The story teaches that desecrating sacred spaces brings consequences. It reinforces the taboo, strengthens the protective barrier around remaining sacred sites, warns others who might be tempted to similar violations. The timing, before the ending of the year, is significant. Not immediately, which might seem too obviously supernatural, but not so delayed that the connection between cause and effect becomes unclear. Within a year is the perfect curse timeframe, long enough to seem like normal misfortune, short enough that everyone remembers the desecration and connects it to the consequence. The theology of sacred space. The sacred grove traditions of Lake Ladoga reveal a sophisticated theological understanding of space, power, and relationship between humans and the spiritual world. At the foundation is the belief that certain locations are spiritually charged, that they serve as points of contact between the everyday world and the realm of spirits or divine powers. This is not pantheism, not every tree and stone is equally sacred, but rather a recognition that the sacred can manifest in specific places, making those places different from their surroundings. Why do spirits concentrate in certain locations? The folklore doesn't explain, but we can infer several possibilities. Perhaps certain natural features, unusual trees, strangely shaped stones, springs with distinctive properties, were understood as signs of spiritual presence, markers indicating where the veil between worlds was thin. Perhaps the sites became sacred through long use, generations of offerings and prayers saturating a location with spiritual energy, making it increasingly powerful over time. The spirits came to expect offerings at certain places because offerings had always been made there, creating a cycle of tradition and presence. Or perhaps, in the Christian context, these sites were understood as having been blessed by God or saints, making them holy not through the presence of nature spirits but through Christian sanctification. The offerings left there were not pagan sacrifices but Christian votive offerings, petitions to saints rather than spirits. In practice, as we've noted, these interpretations likely coexisted and blended. A sacred tree might be understood simultaneously as the dwelling of a nature spirit and as a location blessed by a Christian saint. The offerings might be seen as both honoring the spirit and as prayers to the saint. The distinction that seems clear to us, pagan versus Christian, might not have seemed so clear to practitioners who saw all sacred power as ultimately flowing from the same divine source. The song captures this complexity: feed the sacred spirits, honor the old ways / leave your gifts at twilight, at the closing of the days. Sacred spirits could mean pre-Christian nature spirits, or it could mean Christian saints, or it could encompass both. Old ways suggests pre-Christian tradition, but old relative to what? In 1879, Orthodox Christianity had been in the region for many centuries. Was it still new relative to even older beliefs? The instruction to leave gifts at twilight, at the closing of the days, is evocative. Twilight is a liminal time, neither day nor night, when boundaries become permeable. It's an appropriate time for approaching the sacred, for crossing between mundane and spiritual realms. The function of taboo. The prohibition against cutting sacred trees, disturbing holy stones, or defiling blessed wells served important social and environmental functions beyond their spiritual significance. Social cohesion, shared sacred sites and common taboos created community identity. Everyone in Kauppala knew about the sacred tuomi. Respecting it was a marker of belonging to the community, of sharing its values and beliefs. The outsider who violated the taboo was marked as not community, as someone who didn't share the group's fundamental understandings. Environmental conservation, sacred groves and holy trees were protected from cutting, creating de facto nature preserves within landscapes that were otherwise heavily exploited. A sacred tree could live for centuries because cutting it was forbidden, providing habitat for birds and insects, offering shade and beauty, serving as a landmark. In some cultures, entire groves were protected as sacred, creating biodiversity refuges. While the Lake Ladoga sources don't mention extensive sacred forests, individual sacred trees served a similar function on a smaller scale. Resource management. The practice of offering first fruits to sacred sites was a form of delayed gratification and resource management. You didn't consume or sell everything immediately upon harvest but set aside portions for sacred purposes. This created buffer stocks, encouraged planning, and ritualized the principle that not everything produced should be immediately consumed. Conflict resolution. Sacred sites, being neutral ground protected by powerful taboos, could serve as meeting places where disputes might be mediated. Violating the peace of a sacred site would bring curse upon the violator, creating strong incentive for restraint and cooperation. Psychological functions. The practice of bringing offerings to sacred sites provided mechanisms for dealing with anxiety about unpredictable aspects of life, weather, disease, fertility. You couldn't control whether your cow would give milk or your crops would grow, but you could control whether you honored the spirits appropriately. This created a sense of agency and reduced helpless anxiety. The curse that befell the man who cut the sacred tree served to reinforce all these functions. It demonstrated to the community that the taboos were real, that consequences followed violations, that the old ways still held power. It discouraged others from similar violations, protecting remaining sacred sites. The confrontation of worldviews. The story of the sacred tuomi at Kauppala represents a confrontation between different worldviews, different understandings of how the world works. One worldview holds that certain places and objects are sacred, that spirits or divine powers inhabit or are connected to specific locations, that humans must maintain right relationship with these powers through offerings and taboos, and that violating sacred sites brings supernatural consequences. Another worldview, modernizing, rationalist, influenced by secular thinking or by more orthodox religious interpretation, holds that trees are just trees, that cutting them has no supernatural consequences, that offerings to spirits are superstition, and that curses are imaginary. The man from Jaakkima, drunk or not, might have represented this second worldview. Perhaps he was testing the superstition, proving that nothing bad would happen, demonstrating that the sacred tree was just wood like any other. His curse and death, or misfortune, within a year represents the first worldview's response. See? The powers are real. Violate sacred taboos and suffer the consequences. The tree was protected by more than community tradition, it was protected by spiritual power that enforced the taboo directly. But of course, from the skeptical perspective, correlation isn't causation. The man might have died from completely natural causes having nothing to do with cutting a tree. His misfortune might be coincidence interpreted as curse by believers. The genius of the curse story is that it works regardless of which interpretation is true. If curses are real, the story warns violators of genuine danger. If curses aren't real but people believe they are, the story still works to protect sacred sites by creating fear of consequences and by ensuring that any misfortune befalling a violator will be interpreted as curse fulfillment, damaging the violator's social standing. The ecology of belief. By 1879, when Schwint collected these stories, the sacred grove tradition was in decline. He writes in past tense, Ali en an alet, had been in the past. The sacred tree at Kauppala was cut down. Other sacred sites were being abandoned or forgotten. The old believers who had maintained these practices were dying, and younger generations were less committed to the traditions. Several factors drove this decline. Orthodox Church pressure. Church authorities had always been ambivalent about folk practices that seemed pagan. As the Church's institutional power grew and as more rigorous training of clergy promoted more orthodox theology, pressure increased to suppress practices that involved offerings to spirits or that seemed to honor nature rather than God. Modernization and education. As education spread, as scientific thinking became more influential, as people encountered wider worldviews through travel and trade, traditional beliefs faced challenge. Educated young people might view their parents' offerings to sacred trees as embarrassing superstition. Social change. As communities became more mobile, as economic relationships became more commercialized and less subsistence-oriented, the tight community bonds that supported sacred site traditions weakened. Sacred sites were maintained through community consensus and collective practice. When communities fragmented, sites lost their protection. Physical destruction. Sacred trees could be cut, sacred stones moved, sacred wells filled in. Once the physical site was destroyed, even if some people wanted to maintain the tradition, they had nothing to focus it on. But the traditions didn't disappear entirely. Schwint found plenty of people who remembered them, who could describe the practices in detail, who still believed in the power of curses against violators. The old ways persisted in memory even when they no longer persisted in practice. And perhaps they persist still, in attenuated form. People who wouldn't dream of making offerings to a sacred tree might still feel uncomfortable cutting down a very old tree, might still sense that certain places in the landscape carry particular weight, might still believe that some forms of desecration bring consequences. Other sacred sites. The sacred tuomi at Kauppala was just one example among many. Schwint recorded other sacred sites throughout the region. At Heinäsenmaa, where a monastery had once stood, there were crosses where people left offerings. The crosses were Christian symbols, but the practice of leaving offerings echoed older traditions. People might leave coins, or bread, or other items at the base of the crosses, seeking blessings or giving thanks. At Sarola, specific stones were marked as holy. People brought offerings to these stones, particularly on certain feast days. The stones might have been naturally unusual, large, oddly shaped, or positioned in striking locations, or they might have been marked as sacred through long tradition. Throughout the region, there were holy wells and springs where water was believed to have healing properties or blessing power. People would drink from these wells, bathe in them, or take water home for use in healing or blessing. The song references this diversity. At Heinäsenmaa's crosses, at the stones of Sarola the people brought their offerings to keep the darkness far. This last phrase is revealing, to keep the darkness far. The offerings were protective, apotropaic. They warded off evil, misfortune, darkness, whether literal or metaphorical. The sacred sites served as shields, as points of power that protected communities from threats both natural and supernatural. Maintaining right relationship with the spirits or saints associated with these sites, through regular offerings, through respecting taboos, through proper ritual behavior, kept the community safe. Neglecting the sites or violating their sanctity removed that protection, leaving the community vulnerable to darkness. The warning in the song. The song, The Sacred Grove, contains a repeated refrain that serves as both instruction and warning. Feed the sacred spirits, honor the old ways / leave your gifts at twilight, at the closing of the days / for those who take but give not back will suffer nature's curse / the ancient powers watching make the blessing reverse. This is presented as timeless wisdom, instruction that applies across generations. Feed the spirits, maintain the relationship through offerings. Honor the old ways, respect tradition, don't dismiss or mock what your ancestors believed. Leave gifts at twilight, participate in the practices at the appropriate times and in the appropriate ways. And the warning, for those who take but give not back will suffer nature's curse. This is the key principle. The land provides, crops grow, animals give milk, trees provide timber. Humans take from this abundance. But taking without giving back violates reciprocity, upsets the balance, demonstrates ingratitude and hubris. The curse isn't arbitrary punishment but natural consequence. If you take from the land without honoring the powers that make the land productive, those powers withdraw their blessing. The ancient powers watching make the blessing reverse. The blessing becomes curse. Fertility becomes barrenness. Abundance becomes scarcity. What was given freely is withdrawn. This isn't unique to Lake Ladoga folklore, it appears in agricultural societies worldwide. The land must be honored, the spirits must be fed, reciprocity must be maintained, or else productivity fails. From an ecological perspective, we might interpret this as early understanding of sustainable resource use. You can't just extract continuously without putting anything back. You must leave some resources for regeneration, must respect natural cycles, must recognize limits. Violate these principles and the land itself fails. From a spiritual perspective, it's about right relationship with powers beyond human control. Humans don't own the land or command nature. We are participants in systems we didn't create and can't fully control. Humility, gratitude, and reciprocity are appropriate responses to this situation. The man who cut the sacred tree violated both principles. He took the timber of the tree, without giving back, without respecting the sacred status that demanded preservation. He demonstrated hubris and contempt rather than humility and respect. And the curse, however it operated, was the consequence. Standing at the stump. Imagine yourself at Kauppala, at the site where the great tuomi once stood. The tree is long gone, of course, cut down by the drunken man from Jaakkima over a century before Schwint collected the story, meaning it's been absent for 2 centuries or more from our present perspective. The stump has rotted away. The ground has healed over. There is no physical trace of what once stood there. But knowing the story, the absence becomes presence. This is where the sacred tree stood. This is where people brought their first milk and first grain for generations. This is where community gathered to honor the old ways. This is where spirits were fed and blessings obtained. And this is where desecration occurred, where the drunk outsider cut through centuries of tradition with his axe, where the tree fell like thunder and the people stood in fear, where the curse took shape and the violator's fate was sealed. The landscape holds these layers even when physical traces are gone. Sacred geography persists in story even when the material markers are destroyed. You can't see the tree. But you can imagine it, vast, ancient, white-blossomed in spring, laden with offerings at its base. You can imagine the people gathering there at twilight, leaving their gifts, speaking their prayers, maintaining relationships with powers they might not fully understand but knew better than to ignore. You can imagine the shock and horror when the outsider appeared with his axe. The shouted warnings. The terrible sound of the axe biting into sacred wood. The crash as the great tree fell. And you can imagine the waiting afterward, the community knowing that curse would follow, watching the violator, marking when misfortune arrived, feeling the grim satisfaction and renewed fear when curse proved real, when the ancient powers demonstrated their continued presence and power. The sacred grove is gone. But the story of the sacred grove remains, carrying forward the beliefs and practices and warnings that gave the grove meaning. And in that story's survival, perhaps the grove itself survives, not as living wood but as living memory, not as physical presence but as spiritual lesson. Feed the sacred spirits. Honor the old ways. Leave your gifts at twilight, at the closing of the days. For those who take but give not back will suffer nature's curse. The ancient powers watching make the blessing reverse.